Throughout these 2 days, we've been discussing a wide range of topics, right? Immigration, trade, blockchain, bitcoins, populism, economic reforms. But in my opinion, if there's a key issue in today's policy agenda, in the public debate, this is definitely climate change, climate action and sustainable development. And it could be well argued that for some years the liberal or libertarian movements across the globe have been maybe too passive when it came to climate issues. And this has left a void, a gap for sound, reasonable, sensible, market-based policies when it came to the climate debate. So I think there is a need to move forward for evidence-based and market-based policies which both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time advance towards a more sustainable and circular economy without damaging economic growth and the free enterprise, right? However, I have pretty good news. And the good news is that there are actually very original, innovative organizations and think tanks, young leaders, striving for positive change. And actually the two guest speakers that are joining me today, and I have the pleasure to introduce you now, are a good example of this paradigm shift. So at my left, there's Christopher Barnard. He's the president of the British Conservation Alliance in the UK. Great. Cheers, everybody. So the BCA is a UK-based organization dedicated to promoting market-based environmental solutions, and he's also currently studying his master's in international relations at the London School of Economics. We also have Caroline Kitchens, who's the director of Federal and Government Affairs at the Institut in Washington, D.C. She leads the organization's education and advocacy efforts on Capitol Hill, and as well as on the executive agencies. Her particular focus is on agriculture, harm reduction, and energy policy. And he joined the Institut from the American Enterprise Institute, where she was a senior research associate in social and cultural studies. She graduated with honors from Duke University with a bachelor's degree in history and political science. So, thank you so much. We have a positive start for the panel. So I will start with Chris. So the British Conservation Alliance was founded in July 2019, so not long ago, by a non-partisan group of millennials who saw a glaring gap in the political market in the UK when it came to pro-market, sensible environmentalism. So my question is, what were the reasons that drove the main reasons that made you decide to take action? And why is it so important to harness both the power of the free market and the beauty of our environment to the benefit of everyone?
Thank you. I want to start by apologizing for the way I look. I've had to reassure a lot of people the last few days that this is not in fact a symptom of coronavirus. And you should see the other guy. No, just kidding. But whenever I speak at a conference like this, I like to start by opening and asking you guys a question. So could you please put up your hand if you feel like you personally care about the environment and the world that we live in? Okay, so clearly almost everyone in this room feels like they care about the environment. And I think that's the first answer to your question, Marty, that there's been this narrative for a long time that libertarians don't care about the environment, that we're in bed with the fossil fuel industry to destroy the planet, but clearly you do care, and there are people that do care and that are trying to bring about a change. But there has been a problem by this narrative where for a long time now, the left has dominated the environmental debate. And so you see a lot about discussions about things like the Green New Deal, where they try to bring about more government control, where they think that you need to have top-down regulation in order to combat environmental issues and to combat climate change. And I don't want to steal Caroline's thunder because I know you're going to talk a bit more about the Green New Deal, but I think it really is an excellent example of what I'm talking about. If you read the document of the Green New Deal, it's only 14 pages. for every word that it talks about the environment, it has 10 words where it talks about universal health care, a federal jobs guarantee, food security, jobs, building, federal jobs building platforms. And you see very quickly that we're not actually talking about an environmental platform, but we're talking about a social and an economic and a political platform that simply uses the environment as an excuse to bring about greater government control of all of our lives. And the most important message that at the British Conservation Alliance we're pushing is this idea of decoupling the notion of sacrificing the economy in order to save the planet. And we think that it's entirely compatible to have both economic prosperity and environmental prosperity. The second part of your question about why this is so important to promote free market responses is if you look at some of the evidence out there, so for example, the Heritage, Freedom and Environmental Performance Index, you see that when you have higher economic freedom in countries, you also have better environmental outcomes. And the graph is very clear. There's a very strong correlation that the more economic freedom, the better your environmental outcomes in that country are. The second piece of evidence is something called the Kuznets Curve, where it shows a correlation between CO2 emissions and economic growth up until a certain point, where you reach an amount of prosperity where your CO2 emissions actually decrease. And it shows that richer countries end up having lower emissions and lowering their emissions compared to countries that are less rich. And so you see that issues such as economic freedom and freer markets and prosperity as a result of freer markets actually bring about better environmental outcomes. But what this doesn't mean is that some people then say, oh, well, we should just leave it to the market, because clearly it's already happening. But I don't think that's a very convincing response. And I think that part of the reason for having this panel is to talk about some of the real policy options that we have that we can pursue to have better environmental outcomes as a result of free markets. And so you're talking about policy ideas such as unleashing technology, reducing barriers to innovation, getting rid of things like the precautionary principle that harm nuclear energy and biotechnology and artificial intelligence, which are very crucial in helping combat climate change and are only possible within a free market that rewards innovation and allows for innovation to be pursued by innovators and entrepreneurs rather than by the government. So I want to talk a bit more later in the panel about some of these specific policies that we can pursue. But I think to conclude about why we founded and why we find it so important to promote free market alternatives to things such as the Green New Deal is it's not only from an environmental perspective. So on the one hand, we really need the innovation and the creativity of the free market and the prosperity of the free market to be able to tackle environmental issues and in order to tackle climate change. But it's also really crucial for our movement. Because if as a movement we don't address these issues more seriously, if we don't propose credible alternatives to the things like the Green New Deal, then we will alienate all the people that care about the environment, like yourselves, but that don't have any options and don't have any actual ideas being promoted by their side of the debate. And then we risk pushing more and more people away from organizations like Students for Liberty and more towards people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Green New Deal. So it's both an environmental thing, but also something about the broader liberty movement that we really need to bear into mind why this panel today is so important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this great introduction. So moving on to Caroline, we are well aware that the Institut has been doing a tremendous work in terms of advocacy, encouraging policymakers and particularly Republicans in the US to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with sensible, efficient policy reforms. I would mainly state three of them. So defending property rights from fossil fuel infrastructure. Second, advancing a cleaner environment through market competition. And third, promoting the carbon tax and dividend as the best federal response to climate risk. So my question is, how would you describe the state of the art when it comes to climate reform in the US? And second, are there more cost-efficient alternatives to what we know was a Green New Deal, both in the US and maybe in Europe? I don't know if you're aware of what's going on now in the European Union in this regard. And is there room for political consensus when it comes to climate change?
Sure. Thanks so much, Marty. And thank you, Chris, for all the wonderful work that you and your organization have been doing in this space. I think you summed up so well how important it is for libertarians as a movement to have a smart climate response. So thank you for that. I want to start out by saying that I think we're at a really important time in the U.S. when it comes to discussions over climate change. For so long, the Democrats were the party of climate action, and all anyone heard was big government, top-down solutions, and at the same time, Republicans were frankly the party of climate change deniers. And really that didn't change until less than about a year ago. And I think that happened as a result of this wonderful political gift called the Green New Deal, which we've been discussing. For those that need a refresher, and I know that you touched on this briefly, but a couple elements of the Green New Deal that are completely outlandish. It would require everything from retrofitting every single building in the country to eliminating air travel entirely, to guaranteeing government jobs even for those unwilling to work. That's a quote. So obviously, when AOC and her colleagues actually revealed the text of the Green New Deal, it was met with a lot of ridicule. Even the House Democrats and leadership in Congress started to distance themselves from it. But something really interesting happened, which was that suddenly people started talking about alternatives. And there was a lot of demand for market-based solutions that would not bankrupt the economy. And that was coming from both Democrats and Republicans. Around the same time, the Democrats in the House formed a select committee on climate crisis. I think it was probably their expectation that the Republicans on the committee would, continue to bumble about the climate change hoax, but that's not what happened. Republicans have started singing a completely different tune, and suddenly policymakers on both sides of the aisle really are looking for solutions that are market-based and won't devastate the U.S. economy. Now, I know we don't have time probably for a deep dive into policy proposals today, and I wouldn't bore you with that anyway because I know energy policy is very dense. But I will offer, I think, 3 principles that I think can inform our response to this and show how we can simultaneously shrink the size of government and reduce emissions. And then I'll also touch on a couple specific solutions. I would say the first principle we can embrace is do no harm. In the US and across the world, there are really just an astounding number of things that the government does that actually promote negative environmental outcomes. So first, I think the easiest thing is to look for places where deregulation can help the environment, and we should try to get the government out of the way so that clean energy innovation can flourish. A couple examples. In the US, we actually subsidize millionaires and billionaires to build beach houses on floodplains through our National Flood Insurance Program. We also provide highly subsidized crop insurance even to wealthy agribusinesses, which ultimately just encourages overproduction and planting on marginal and sensitive lands. So I think cutting subsidies for harmful behavior is the first step. We can also roll back regulations on clean energy sources. To give a few examples, I think nuclear and hydropower could be a really important part of the clean energy economy, but they're simply caught up in too much government red tape to really reach their full potential. Between 2005 and 2013, it took more than 15 years for the average hydropower project to be approved. Similarly, nuclear plant designs have been developed that are just far safer and more efficient than the ones currently in operation, but it takes years and years to get approval for them to come to development. So we should push for a streamlined regulatory process that cuts back red tape and helps industry deploy more clean technology. Second principle, we should promote energy competition and choice. We're living in a time where there's just huge demand for clean energy. Why not let various energy sources compete against one another in the market? In America, in all but I think 20 states, Americans actually don't have the option to choose in an open electricity market. Their electrical service is provided by a local utility company that's basically given a monopoly. We should be encouraging an open market, which would force energy providers to compete with one another, and this would ultimately allow consumers to demonstrate their preference for clean energy, and it would also drive down energy costs. Third principle, we should be taxing bads, not goods. I'm a libertarian. I don't generally care for taxes. I know taxation is theft. However, if we are going to use taxes as a policy tool, I think we should be using them to create price signals that disincentivize bad things like emissions rather than good things like capital. At our street and a lot of economists, we do believe that a price on carbon emissions is the most efficient and market-friendly way to reduce emissions. I think an important thing about a carbon tax to remember is that it's also a source of revenue. So there are a lot of options of what you can do with that revenue, and it really matters. For example, you could do a dividends approach where some of it is returned to the American citizens. You could use a swap approach, which is what our street favors, which is to offset another burdensome tax like the corporate income tax with revenue generated from a carbon tax. Or, you could even use it to build a wall on the southern border. I'm just kidding. For the record, I don't think we should use a carbon tax to build a wall. But joking aside, what I mean by that is that what you do with the money really matters. We can look at the carbon tax and design it in the right way that it becomes an opportunity to reduce the tax burden and incentivize reduced emissions rather than, funneling the money into whatever grand project AOC and the progressive Democrats want. That being said, I do have to admit, much to my disappointment, a price on carbon is simply not feasible in the US political climate at the moment. I think we're making progress to get there, but essentially all Republicans in Congress have disavowed a carbon tax because they view it as a tax hike. And even progressive states like Oregon that have sought to implement a carbon tax have failed. So I have to admit a price on carbon may not happen in the US anytime soon, but I think it is a really important part of the conversation, and it's another market-based tool that we can all have in our arsenal to reduce emissions. So I'll stop there for now, but happy to go into any of this a little more later on.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I think you highlighted some very key points on clean energy and how market deregulation and competition can actually unleash and drive greater sustainability in the future. So delving into policy and governance. So back in 2010, Elinor Ostrom, who actually gives name to our think tank, our institution, warned us it would be better to self-consciously adopt a polycentric approach to climate change in order to gain the benefit at multiple scales, as well as to encourage experimentation and learning from diverse policies. So Ostrom advocated for vesting authority in individuals, communities, NGOs, local governments, as opposed to concentrating power and authority at global or national levels. She believed in the ability of the individual and the community to be able to take the right course of action and not wait for government to make the first move. So do you share this Ostrom's bottom-up approach towards sustainable development and green policy? And what are some current examples of such approach you could think of? Do you believe collective action at the grassroots can ultimately force change at the top level? So, Chris.
Yeah. You should have a flyer on your seats, actually, with information about a book we are publishing next month. It's actually the first ever book on free market environmentalism internationally. We have 21 authors from 15 organizations from 5 countries contributing to this book. And the reason I bring this up is because one of the chapters is actually about Ostrom, dedicated to her ideas. And so, needless to say, we are a fan. And I think that the reason why it is important to bring up Ostrom within these debates is many people instinctively look to national, if not global government to solve things like climate change. But the very first thing that we must emphasize when we talk to those people is that the government actually has a terrible track record on the environment. If you look at the socialist countries, for example, of the Soviet Union, or more recently Venezuela, they would exploit resources like no other. They would, the so-called smokestack economies, they would turn entire ecosystems for profit, and they would just industrialize their entire country with zero regard for private property and for the conservation of ecosystems. And so that is just a very good example of how big government has perverse environmental outcomes. Also, if you look at the European Union, a less drastic example, But the EU has also had terrible environmental consequences. If you look at the common agricultural policy or the common fisheries policy, they pay farmers to get rid of ecosystems, to get rid of bushes, to get rid of trees, to get rid of forests that are really important environmentally, and they're simply paid through subsidies for that. The common fishery policy has almost eradicated fishing stocks in some parts of the North Sea because of the perverse government bureaucratic incentives that it provides. So I think one of the main things that we as believers in free markets should emphasize is that the government is terrible on the environment. The government has a terrible track record on producing good environmental outcomes. And the reason I bring this up is because Ostrom realized that as well. She said the problem with government is that it's top-down, it's one-size-fits-all, it's regulatory, and it doesn't understand what the actual issues are. And so it creates these bad environmental outcomes. Now, interestingly, she didn't advocate that the opposite of that we should have all of a sudden just full property rights for everything, that we should privatize everything, because she felt that that would damage the idea of local communities being able to cooperate together voluntarily to come up with environmentally sustainable outcomes at the local level. And she said that full private property rights would erect certain cost barriers that would actually damage environmental outcomes on the local level. But what she did say is that the government should allow communities to be empowered and be allowed to group together at the local level without government interference to come up with the solutions that work for their community at their given time and for their people. So what this means concretely is that first we should devolve authority as closely as possible from the central government to local governments. We should understand the importance of Hayek's principle of tacit knowledge, that people that are market actors within their context know the issues that they are facing the most, and they're also the best place to come up with the solutions that can actually make a difference. And so local communities are far better at tackling the issues in their communities than any bureaucrat in the central government in the capital far away, right? And one of the best things about what you mentioned, polycentricity, is that this allows for political competition between communities. Because if you devolve authority to a bunch of different communities, they will all have their own way of trying to come up with environmentally sustainable practices. And that means that there's a competition between them because they can just see the others and how they are doing. If one community is doing well, then of course the same ideas in your community as well. The problem with the government is that when they propose a one-size-fits-all approach, is that that's the only one. So if it's bad or good, there's no change. And as we all know, it will be bad, so there is no alternative for it. So I think that's really an important part of the polycentric aspect of Ostrom's theory. One really, you asked about examples, a really good example that I like a lot is in Turkey, there's a fishing community. And obviously the problem with fishing is that there are some good spots for fish, there are some bad spots, and all the fishers compete for the best spots, and they try to fish as much as possible before the others can get there. So what they did in this fishing village in Turkey is they brought all the fishers together, and they said, we're going to come up with a system voluntarily, no one is coerced, we just decide to do this because it is the best for all of us, is that they created a rotational system, so that one day you are in one fishing spot, the next you are in the next, and it just keeps going like that until you come back to the first one. And so what happens is that it gave incentives to fishers to not overfish when they were in a good fishing spot, because they knew that within a week or 2 weeks they would be fishing back there again, and that they would damage themselves as well as everyone else in their community if they were to overfish. And that is something that local fishermen realized on their own, without government interference. They realized that this was the best for their environmental interest, but also for their own economic interest. And it expands their own economic freedom to be able to pursue environmentally friendly outcomes without perverse government incentives involved. So that's a really good example of kind of polycentric, decentralized governance at the local community. Now, there is a bit of a problem when you try to apply that to climate change, because obviously climate change is not a local issue, it's an international, global issue. And it's also, you're talking about something that you can't really put down at the local level. You're talking about carbon emissions, they're kind of everywhere, right? The atmosphere. And so when, as libertarians, we can still learn lessons from Ostrom's theory in that we need to develop a framework that best allows for businesses, individuals, and communities to voluntarily pursue the best and most environmentally friendly outcomes. I think it's important to emphasize that here as well, this means less government, not more. But it also means effective government, because the government can pursue policies that reduce barriers to competition, for example, like you were talking about, that allow certain actors to enter the energy market, which right now, monopoly markets with subsidies from the central government are stopping people from entering and bringing out competition. It's also removing barriers to entry for innovation, for innovative technologies, which right now the precautionary principle, again, talking about the EU, they're very bad with allowing innovation to occur at the federal EU level. And also talking, for example, about clean free trade across the world, that right now there's still a lot of tariffs on environmental goods and services across borders, whereas exactly what we need is to be able to share these things across borders. That if I come up with a good technology in the UK, I should be allowed to sell it to the US as well and make my profit and allow people to benefit from that as well. But right now that is not happening. And so what happens is that we are living in a world where the government erects these arbitrary barriers to innovation and to clean businesses and to energy competition, which actually creates very bad environmental outcomes and also infringes on individuals' option to pursue environmentally friendly activities. So I think, yes, there's this element that the grassroots level is the most important, but I think it also does start to an extent with the top, because right now the government is the one imposing these barriers, and we need to work on lobbying the government to get rid of these barriers to then really unleash the power of local communities, of individuals, of businesses, and ultimately the grassroots to come up with these solutions to climate change, which the government clearly cannot.
Yeah, that was very well put. I would agree with what Chris said. And I also do agree with Eleanor Ostrom's theory on this. Excuse me. I think that it does have to happen from the bottom up. I think, as I mentioned before, there is a very clear preference from consumers for clean, cheap energy, and it's ultimately that demand from consumers that I think will drive a clean energy revolution if we get the government out of the way. I would also argue that not only is government not essential to solving climate change, it can actually be counterproductive for reasons that Chris already mentioned, but also because I think we've seen over and over what can happen when the government becomes involved in clean energy development, whether it's clean energy subsidies, offering green jobs. I think we know that ultimately this becomes captured by cronyism and special interests. We see these green boondoggle projects that cost taxpayers a lot of money and might, pad the pockets of certain well-connected businesses, but they don't actually provide taxpayers a good return on investment when you look at the environmental outcomes. A classic example here, when you look at the U.S., is our infamous Solyndra scandal, where a California-based company, a solar power company, received more than $500 million in stimulus funds under the Obama administration before they were ultimately bankrupt and investigated by the FBI. And this kind of thing happens all the time. You can see very clearly what can go wrong when the government starts doling out green subsidies and green jobs. And I also want to emphasize that without government action, there has recently just been huge leadership and investment in the private sector to promote sustainability. I'm not sure if you guys were at the presentation earlier, but I think, I don't want to risk getting her name wrong, but she was wonderful, the Swedish lady, and she highlighted the wonderful things that private sector companies are doing proactively. In the US, Microsoft has been a huge leader in this. They recently announced an aggressive climate plan, and they said they'll be carbon negative within just 10 years. And by the year 2050, Microsoft aims to have removed enough carbon to account for all of their emissions ever since 1975 when they started. And that's really just one example. There's just a massive corporate social responsibility movement happening across the world, and increasingly it includes green commitments. Personally, I think this is really exciting and a really welcome development, and it's also purely voluntary. I'm not sure whether it'll be enough to address global warming. I'm not sure how long it'll take. We can debate whether the government should be, putting additional price signals around emission to speed it up, which is what I believe. But at the end of the day, I really do think that government action is not going to be what solves climate challenges. If we are going to solve climate challenges, it will be through the actions of industry and business leaders who innovate and who practice sustainability. And I personally think that solutions are way more likely to come from the next Bill Gates than from the next, Paris Agreement or UN Climate Commission. And also, ultimately, I think it will be through the preferences of everyday individuals like all of you and us who are demanding clean energy and who want a cleaner world.
Yeah, so before opening the floor for questions, let me just ask for a wrap-up message for a full audience of young-minded individuals who are ready to champion free market solutions to climate change.
Yeah, I think the single best way that you in this room can all help combat climate change is to follow us on Twitter. For seriously, at BCA_eco. No, but on a more serious note, I think a few months ago I was moderating a panel at a Students for Liberty conference in Milan, and it was an hour-and-a-half panel, and the problem was that we spent the entire hour-and-a-half debating the science of climate change. And obviously, I think we can all agree that we've gone way past that. I think there is this consensus, whether you agree with it or not, there is a consensus in society that there is a problem and that we need to tackle it. And the libertarian movement really risks hurting itself in the long term if we don't address this adequately. So I think rather than debating the science behind climate change, we should be promoting classical liberal free market alternatives to things such as a Green New Deal. And we should be telling people that actually the government is not the answer, we already tell them that, but that this is the answer and that we have free market solutions. And for example, the book that we're publishing, I really encourage you to, there'll be a digital copy available 5 weeks from now or so. I really encourage you to read it because there'll be some really great ideas in there about how we, as believers in the free market, can promote libertarian free market principles on the environment and on climate change, and to show people that the government really is not the answer.
Yeah, I think when I look at how particularly Republicans in Congress have struggled to articulate a coherent position on climate change, so much of it seems to be generational to me. I think we've seen, and this conference is evidence of it, that younger people really are the future and they care about these issues. And I think the Liberty movement is getting much better at this. I would just encourage everyone to be very proud and vocal advocates for free market solutions. I really think for too long, the big government advocates have really owned this space, and they've sort of claimed a moral authority, which frankly I find really annoying, and they're really self-righteous. So I would love to see people being more vocal and proud with free market solutions. We shouldn't allow them to have this moral authority any longer. We need to tell everyone that libertarians do care about protecting the world. And not only do we care, we also have solutions. And at the end of the day, these solutions will work way better than any of the top-down big government approaches, because I don't think any climate action will be successful unless it effectively harnesses market forces.
So I hope you have some questions. Let's open the floor.
Hello. Okay. So my question is, how will the CO2 tax affect meat production? Because we know it's very important in the climate change.
I think the question was how a carbon tax would affect production. Meat production. I'm not sure that I have an answer to that. I'm not quite sure how it would affect meat production in particular. I will say that, as I mentioned, I think it is so important that we design a carbon tax the right way. A well-designed carbon tax will not hurt businesses and it will not harm production because it would offset their burdensome taxes in other ways. So I think that if we design it correctly, I would hope that it would not have any negative externalities for the meat industry or any other.
And I'm not an expert on the carbon tax, but often at conferences I get a lot of questions about like the issues with the animal industry, and obviously it's very difficult to get people to move away from eating animals and things like that. And obviously it has an environmental impact. I think our response is that we should be encouraging innovation such as biotechnology and genetically modified organisms because they have really good environmental outcomes, and there's a lot of scaremongering about it, and we should be showing organizations like Greenpeace that they're hypocrites when they say they're against GMOs, whereas GMOs and biotechnology really will be the solution to solving emissions in the animal sector. And the only way we're going to get there is by getting government out of the way and stopping the innovation from happening when it needs to happen.
Thank you. I hear a lot of talk about CO2 and trying to fight the climate change, but from what we see from IPCC and basically all the people on the side of fighting the global warming is a lot of just really loads of lies and manipulation, and the science is pretty sketchy behind it. And so do you really think that we should be focusing on CO2? You make it sound like it's a done thing, but I'm not so sure about that. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think you're absolutely right that there has been a lot of alarmism on climate change, which I think has been really counterproductive to efforts to actually do something about it. I'm not a climate scientist. I can only believe what the best experts tell me, but I think there is a clear consensus that yes, climate change is an issue, it is man-made, and we should be doing something to address it. We can debate about what those solutions are, but at the end of the day, I think this absolutely is something that we need to address. We just need to find better solutions than the ones that have been used thus far.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's really, we've reached a point where bringing up the science is really just unhelpful, and it hurts our movement more than it might help. And for example, in the UK, where the British Conservation Alliance operates, there is a legal target to reach net zero of carbon emissions by 2050, and that is legally enshrined. So that means that we can debate the science all we want. We can say that climate change isn't real. I believe it is real, but it doesn't matter because there's a legal target there. And if we just keep bring up these ideas about the science and these debates, then we're going to completely miss the window of opportunity to promote free market solutions. And I think that's really one of the biggest issues that we have right now in the movement, is that we don't understand the movement, the kind of enthusiasm and the passion behind organizations like Extinction Rebellion and the school strikes that Greta Thunberg inspires, that they're not concerned about these things. They want solutions to this problem, and we need to be there to be able to provide better solutions, because if we don't, then we'll end up with Green New Deals, and that's worse for us on all fronts.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are two levels which are often not discussed. So there's the climate science part, and then people seem to jump to conclusions. So, okay, now we have to just lower our carbon emissions. But there seem to be like many questions on the route. So one of them, let me point out two. One of them seems to be, well, if we suggest or if there's a Green New Deal suggested or certain solutions, do the means that are suggested actually solve the problem? And if we don't have any solutions available, maybe the better way of dealing with it is not like spending a lot of money on a solution or apparent solution that doesn't work and having to deal with the consequences. Maybe then you should prepare in view of the consequences. And the second is, which is not seriously discussed, I feel, is that, well, many things change, and people are usually kind of really, or in a way, conservative, even though they don't say they are afraid of like big changes, and there seem to be like also very positive effects coming along with changes and new opportunities. So would be maybe interesting to like discuss that, for whom it maybe is like advantages and what the positive sides of climate change might be. And I would like, feel comfortable like addressing the full spectrum of questions, and maybe you can answer to those 2 points that come up and are rarely discussed.
I fully agree with you that the Green New Deal represents the worst of both worlds, because on the one hand, it would wreck the economy and have massive government control over basically every sector of the economy. And at the same time, I don't think the Green New Deal will actually have any good environmental outcomes. I don't think it aligns the incentives to be able to come up with environmentally sustainable outcomes. For example, it would seek to completely ban fracking and nuclear. Whereas we know that right now, 80% of clean energy in the US is produced by fracking and nuclear. And their response is really not convincing. And the result would be that when it fails, because it will, is that we'll have to then rely on like stopgap, dirty fossil fuel resources to be able to come up with the energy that we still need as an economy. So I think you're right that both on the environmental front and the kind of political/economic front, it fails. I think that when it comes to what you mentioned, like positive aspects of climate change, I don't feel like I'm very well suited to. I'm not an expert on like positive aspects of climate change. I know some people talk about CO2 helping vegetation and things like that. I think that there is a problem when you're looking at communities that face real existential risks as a result of climate change, if it's through extreme weather events or through rising sea levels. I think that those questions outweigh any potential positives. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but again, the science is pretty, there's a pretty strong consensus that there are issues, and those issues right now are very important for us to address, and we risk, if we don't do it, then we risk allowing the worst of both worlds, like the Green New Deal, to emerge.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
We have to.
Hello, thank you. I believe and I agree with what Caroline said about the fact that the environmental revolution or the change that it's to be done in order to be more environmentally friendly must come from the consumers and the business owners, but not from the government, of course. However, I believe it's necessary for this to happen that the society is aware of the problem with the environment. And this happens only in the developed countries, but it's not going to happen soon, at least I believe so, in more undeveloped countries. However, climate change and pollution, it's a problem that affects us all equally, both the people in the developed and in the undeveloped countries. So what solution would you give to this problem specifically? Thank you.
Yes, so what I mentioned earlier with the Kuznets Curve, so that as countries become richer, they reach a level of prosperity where their carbon emissions actually drop. And I think what we should be doing as much as we can is allowing countries, developing countries that have high emissions, to get as rich as they can, and to help them get there through things such as free trade, to then allow them to become rich enough to tackle climate issues themselves, and also for the people in their countries to reach a certain level of consciousness where they start caring more about environmental issues. And so again, sorry to reference the book, but that we have a lot of talk about, there's an international sanction on how to provide carrots for developing countries to want to be part of a kind of clean free trade movement where you reduce tariffs on environmental goods and services so that countries like India and China can share in the technology and share in the knowledge that we have, but also in unleashing international capital flows towards clean energy sources and towards allowing, for example, energy choice and competition in these countries. And I think that we should be flying the flag of free market reforms in our international commitments when we go to COP in Glasgow next year, we need to tell them that actually there are certain free market solutions that will help you get richer as well as help you target some of these climate issues. And so I think it's very much this idea of free markets first, and then many of the other issues, poverty and climate change, will follow from that.
Yeah, I think that was really well put, and I think it is a very real issue that, excuse me, if companies like the U.S. were to initiate a carbon tax, it could put them at an international competitive disadvantage. And there is a very real issue of carbon leakage where, sorry, it's not coronavirus, I promise. There is a very real issue of carbon leakage where, high-emitting industries might just go elsewhere, or people might import high-emitting products from elsewhere if places like the EU and America do enact a carbon tax. I think that is a very real issue we need to address. I think trade liberalization is the answer, and more trade of clean energy, and I do hope that through the leadership of countries like the US and the EU, that other countries will also learn to embrace free market solutions as well. But I know it's not an easy answer, and it's a real problem we have to address.
And just to follow up very quickly, the answer is not what they're promoting on the other side of the debate, where they kind of promote degrowth strategies or to prevent economic development, because then those countries will never be able to reach a certain level of environmental sustainability, and really prosperity here is really the key. No.
Wait, I was just going to add one more thing, and this is not an endorsement of it, but I think an important point to bring up in this debate is that a border adjustment tax is a real potential possibility to address some of these inequities that arise. Again, it would have to be structured the right way, and from what I can tell, it could be very problematic with the WTO, but that is, I think, another policy instrument that could be considered.
Yeah. So I think it's a little bit weird as a libertarian to hear talking about making taxes higher for the ones that make too much emissions. I think we should be talking about, if you want incentive good companies to have a less environmental impact, to lower taxes, and then that's a big incentive for every company to know, okay, if I go more environmentally friendly, I can lower my taxes. And also, I think then, because of course the government doesn't really care about environment, that's for me very clear, and they're just using that as an excuse to make more money for them. And if we promote these ideas, maybe the average people will realize that actually what the government wants, it's more money, but not really to solve the problem. So maybe I think the libertarians should be talking more about lowering taxes than increasing them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we should not institute a carbon tax unless it's coupled with a swap and a reduction in another tax. So a carbon tax should be completely revenue neutral so that it would not increase the tax burden on companies. And the reason I believe that is because this is far better than any other top-down government solution that would impose restrictions on companies. Ultimately, this just puts a price signal in place, but doesn't overall increase the tax burden for companies, if that makes sense. So I know it might be unusual to think of because we haven't seen it structured that way in the past, but in an ideal world, I would like to see a carbon tax replace something like the corporate income tax that puts a huge burden on companies.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth pointing out that we would never advocate for a carbon tax on top of what is now being proposed or what the current situation is. I mean, in my ideal world, we'd have a zero corporate tax with a carbon tax to take into account the negative externalities of the economic activities. I think this is also an area where we have to look at evidence. So one area where a carbon tax actually worked very well is in British Columbia and Canada, where they introduced a carbon tax at the same time as cutting income tax. And so what happened is that GDP grew faster in British Columbia than the rest of Canada, and carbon emissions also went down faster than the rest of Canada. So the economy grew and carbon emissions went down. This is the best of both worlds, right? And the reason the way they did that is by implementing a smart carbon tax that actually was offset by reductions in other taxes and put more money in people's pockets and made the entire economy much more sustainable as well as more profitable.
I think we have time for a last question over the girl over there at the back.
So thank you for your time. A link that becomes apparent when you're studying climate change is a link between climate and war. For instance, the Pentagon's greenhouse gas emissions sometimes surpasses the greenhouse gas emissions of entire industrialized nations such as Sweden or Denmark. And furthermore, I think like something like 1.2 billion tons of carbon was released since since the invasion of Afghanistan happened in 2001. So I'm wondering, what is your perspective on the link between demilitarization and, like free market, and if there are any free market solutions to demilitarization, or is that something that has to be pressured through political means?
Yeah, and I know the stat. I think if the U.S. military were a country, it'd be the 8th largest emitter in the world. So it is a lot of CO2 emissions we're talking about. I think, yeah, from a standard kind of libertarian, anti-war, pro-peace perspective, having a military reduction and less interventionism across the world would also help reduce emissions there, and that's one aspect of it. So you could certainly promote a more kind of less interventionist foreign policy, which would necessarily also then include a smaller military footprint and emissions footprint. And then it's interesting because you mentioned war. Another issue with climate change and war is when you start having communities that are uprooted and start moving around to try and flee some of the consequences of climate change. Obviously, that will also create a lot of strife between communities, and there's a real risk there as well that by uprooting communities, you create a lot of tension that might also spill over into wars and conflicts that are exacerbated by climate change. You have in parts of Kenya, for example, when you have crop failures, which are increasingly influenced by climate change, you see that the farmers there are reacting in ways that they really shouldn't, and then you just kind of have like turf wars between different farmers. And so it's really just in everyone's interest to tackle these issues, again, from both an environmental perspective, but also from a kind of pro-peace perspective.
I think we are running out of time, so thank you so much, Chris and Caroline, for this enlightening discussion. I think you really covered some key issues and policy proposals. So just as a wrap-up, I'd invite you to read the upcoming book by the VCA and follow the R Street Institute and also the Ostrom Institute. So many thanks.